Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the public and private partnerships within the proposed Action for Rare Diseases webinar. I welcome you all to joining me today. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Just to advise you that this webinar is being recorded and will be put on the Together for Rare Diseases website once it has been completed, recorded and available for people to hear back. So if there are colleagues or friends who've been unable to join today, then please feel free to direct them to that when that happens. We will be undertaking two presentations at the beginning of the webinar and then a panel discussions. May I please ask members to put questions for our panel in the chats and use that as a function to make comments. And throughout the webinar, the Together for Rare Disease Secretariat will be putting into the chats links to relevant documentation and/or initiatives and websites into the chats for people to refer to at their leisure once the webinar is completed. In terms of questions for our two initial presenters, I'd like you to hold those for later, unless there are burning questions in which the Secretariat will highlight those to me. So without further ado, I thought it might be useful if I gave the people listening a very quick summary of what Together for Rare Diseases is. And those of you that have had the opportunity to be involved will know a little bit about it. But essentially, it's a multi-stakeholder alliance. It's looking to unlock opportunities for ERNs to collaborate with the pharmaceutical industry. And it's been born out of understanding that whilst there are over 7,000 rare diseases, 95% of those rare diseases still don't have a dedicated treatment. So we're really keen in this initiative to confirm and build dialogues where the EU can collaborate more helpfully with the global industry leaders and think about how that research can really be undertaken in the construct of working with ERNs and helping them fulfill their full potential in the research arena, so that we can start to develop some transferable learning around how those partnerships can work that can benefit all the ERNs, no matter what their size and their resourcing and their current intensity of research. We're really keen to ensure that public and private partnerships, which we feel are the key to unlocking those solutions for those 95% of rare diseases that currently don't have any treatments. And they're and the ERNs are part of a really complicated European ecosystem. And we really want to support the ERNs and the industry to build those partnerships in order to change the landscape for the research arena. So we've been lucky enough to have a number of activities being undertaken in this space, and we are looking to move that forward in the near future. It's really important to highlight here that the Together for Rare Diseases initiative was not created to tackle or address the conversations that have been going on about ERNs becoming legal entities. What we're really looking to do in this space is find ways of working together with the industry and the ERNs, despite this conversation happening at a much different level. The Together for Rare Disease initiative is one of many initiatives that are going on in the rare disease space, such as Moonshot, the EJPRD, so the Rare Disease Partnership, and the future of the Rare Disease Partnership. Since the launch of Together for Rare Diseases, we have been undertaking a number of activities, and one of those activities is the development of a white paper, which is due to be published very soon, and you'll hear a little bit more about it shortly. And this looks at different approaches to ERN and industry partnerships. We've undertaken two online multi-stakeholder meetings where we've extracted learnings on existing partnerships and collaborations that have gone on in the rare disease space, And what we've done with that white paper is developed a number of policy asks, which were launched in the European Parliament in November 2022. We've been very well supported by our MEP champions within Parliament, who are looking to help us address and run forward those policy asks. The colleagues from the FRIPA Secretariat will be putting in the chats very shortly some references to those policy asks, so please feel free to refer to them when you have a moment. Next slide, please. So what have we been doing? So we've been, as I said, gathering research insights and case studies into the types of collaborations that industry and the ERNs could partner around, and they have been fed into the white paper that you'll hear about shortly. This year, we're launching a number of pilot projects. So we reached out to both ERNs and to industry partners to develop a number of areas where ERNs could be collaborating with industry. Those projects will be looking into the different constructs and the different governance structures and things that can be undertaken in order for those partnerships to flourish. We are also undertaking active engagement with stakeholders at the EU level, looking at that wider research ecosystem for rare diseases to help ERN and the industry collaboration become more fruitful and become a real engine and foundation for further and further collaborations. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the activities that have been going on, just to give you a bit of a flavour, we've got a white paper that's due to be published in April 2023. We will be presenting on the 17th of April at the Nordic Rare Disease Summit in Stockholm. We are presenting at the ERNI meeting at the end of this week. And we will also be running a dedicated Together for Rare Diseases track at the World Orphan Drugs Congress in Barcelona at the end of October. And as with last year, we're hoping to present back to European Parliament at the end of November what we've learned from the pilots this year and what we can do to continue to progress those partnerships going forward. So this webinar today is looking at what support, what activities, what policy actions can be taken to support those collaborations between ERNs and industry in the context of the ask around the Rare Disease Action Plan. So what can the action plan do to enable this to happen? What are the kind of policy and political commitments we might be looking for? And what are the tools needed to create a really good EU rare diseases landscape so that the ecosystem is fully collaborative and it really benefits the patients going forward? I'd now like to introduce Jan Lecam, who needs absolutely no introduction, to take us through why the European Action Plan on Rare Diseases is so beneficial for these collaborations. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and it's a pleasure to be with you for this webinar of Together for Rare Diseases. So really the reason why EURDAS and the rare disease community are advocating for European Action Plan for Rare Diseases is that, one, there is huge unmet needs of the people living with rare diseases, so not only medical but social also. Second, huge opportunities in terms of advancements of science and technologies, but also innovation in diagnostic, in treatments, in healthcare organization and social services. And three, the demonstration that in the last 15 years, we've made significant progress precisely thanks to the mobilization of all the actors within European policy and national policies. And that makes a difference to the people living with rare disease. So that really took us toward the development of a new policy framework, which later we called European Action Plan on Rare Diseases. And I will quote here what is in the call to action from Czech Republic with the other member states, is to say, to update and reinforce precisely this last rare disease strategy from 2008 with the Commission Communication Rare Disease, 2009 Council Recommendation for Action on Rare Diseases, and to prepare better the next 10, 15 years in order to grasp on these huge opportunities. and to continue the challenges in terms of genomics, technology, and scientific advancement. The second objective mentioned is to bring together existing EU strategies and action in a comprehensive framework. And I think that's key, is that it's not sufficient to have Horizon Europe program and a strategy here, a strategy on ERN, a strategy on with a regulation on orphan medicines, and another one on pediatric, and etc. So to have all these elements, they are all each of them important, but we need to bring them together, to federate them around goals, and to have a comprehensive approach and a holistic approach to the person's needs, but also to integrate and sustain the EU level by integrating the national plan within a European strategy in order to reach these goals. So I mentioned that looking at the next 10, 15 years, and precisely we took an approach which is to perform, as most of you know, a foresight study called WARE 2030 that was initiated by the European Parliament. It was funded by the European Commission. Then there was a call for tender. We've been selected with a group of academic leaders, including Orphanet, 2 ERNs, and specialists in foresight studies, working in other areas than health, and also with the Imperial College London. And this work of 2 years and a half took us to develop a knowledge base, to articulate the main trends that are being identified. And we worked with a panel of 240 experts of different horizons and different member states. Also were involved into this consultation process, the healthcare providers of the European Funds Network, and kindly dedicated time to the exercise. And also there were surveys of patients and families and of the patient organizations in Europe, and national conferences or workshops. And at the end, with all this exercise, it's about 6,000 persons which have been involved at one step or another. But the core has been these 240 experts. And that's the basis of the credibility of the work performed. So the analysis took us to defining 4 scenarios, and there was a preferred scenario selected during a European conference on rare diseases. And that in scenario is investment for social justice. And after that, the panel of experts, and again, all the constituents I mentioned, the ERNs and the surveys to patients, all that, helped us to define 8 policy recommendations in order to get to this preferred scenario of investment in social justice. And the first recommendation that of these 8 is to have precisely a European framework and a new European framework and national plans, again, or national strategies on rare diseases. And the other recommendations are covering earlier diagnosis, healthcare, integrated and person-centered care, patient partnership, research, data, and treatment. And what is new with the approach proposed is that it's a goal-based strategy. And I would really like to insist on that, is that the objective here is not to say, let's have more registries or create centers of expertise and etc., or rare disease day, etc. But it's more, how can we have specific goals which are articulated from the Sustainable Development Goals? And the 3 pillars that were identified are to ensure healthy lives and promoting well-being of people living with rare disease, with specific targets on reducing the diagnostic delays to 6 months. We really even would like to push to measure improvement of survival on average across diseases or across certain type of diseases, but we need for that to have a stronger basis, I would say, benchmark in order to measure these improvements, but they are measured in some of the rare diseases, so we could scale it up. Second pillar is to reduce inequalities for people living with rare diseases, and with sub-targets like reducing the social and economic impact on the persons affected and their families, with an objective of reducing by 30% in 10 years, which is aligned again with the SDGs. Building, that's the third pillar, building resilient infrastructures in order to support the innovation, and particularly the sub-target of getting about 1,000 new treatments approved within the next 10 years. And that was not just dreams, it was really based on extrapolation by Imperial College London, based on the marketing authorization of the last 20 years by the FDA and EMA, but also of the products in the pipeline today for designation, but also in clinical trials, both in the US and in Europe. So with this approach, we have this goal-based strategy, and the 8 recommendations are forming kind of a roadmap, and this roadmap is being proposed as the basis to inform a future European action plan on rare diseases. As part of this, in one of the recommendation, one of the important pillars on the future of the rare disease ecosystem is the public-private partnership. And I say ecosystem because some of the key messages in the recommendations made is to bring together much more research and healthcare, powered by data and data analytics in the middle, but also all the partnership between the different public partners within Europe, and that's the current development of the RD partnership in particular, which is the next generation after the European Joint Program Co-Fund, but also the partnership between public and private. And today we already, without waiting to have a European action plan, we're already progressing with the partners, with the stakeholders in the sector on this public-private partnership. The Moonshot for Rare Diseases, initiated with FPA and with now the different syndicates of industry and different infrastructure partners, is now moving on, and that's for the public partnership more in research, more upstream, I would say. But it does include the generation of more evidence in the partnership between ERNs and industry, and that takes us to Together for Rare Diseases. It is clear, and that's not only Eurordis saying that, it was really through that work with the 240 experts, with the national workshops and conferences, which brings together also national authorities and industry and patients and clinicians and researchers. It's also through the surveys of the patients that we can say that public-private partnership is an important key success factor, that there will not be success in that ecosystem without that public-private partnership, and particularly positioned with the European Funds Network. And now to conclude, I would like to add some more personal reflections to that, is that I started by working in the field of cancer, so I continue to keep an eye on what's happening in cancer. And we have a fantastic organization in Europe, which is the EORTC. And this European Organization for Research and Treatment on Cancer is a structure, a platform which is dedicated precisely to make the link between the clinicians, the academic research, and the industry in order to do studies on specific products, on treatment protocols, or different types of studies on survivors of cancer, etc. That exists since about 40 years. There has been no scandal, as far as I know. It works very well. So why what we're doing in cancer cannot work, and including on rare cancers through EORTC, doesn't work at large for rare diseases? Really, it's a question, in fact, more of representations, of mindset, of mental representation, rather than to look at the reality of what is doable and not doable, and more talking about fears than about actual facts. So we need to look at the facts, and that's what Together for Rare Disease is doing by looking at facts and solutions. And my second comment is that I can recall when I started to work, because I come from a financial background, an MEA, and I started as a financial auditor, and one of my first missions in the field of cancer was in fact to look at the mess that was existing in the comprehensive cancer centers and the hospitals, with each clinician creating its little association or foundation in order to get the money from the association raising funds in the field of cancer or from the industry, and doing their little grocery to manage the funds. But they could not be blamed. There was no framework in place. So they were just trying to do their work, to try to help their patients and to try to do research. So they were inventing ad hoc solutions like that. Today, the field of cancer has progressed with a more structured approach. We don't have that in rare diseases at large, and that's what is missing. And when we look at the European Funds Network today and where we are, in fact, each clinician is struggling to put in place solutions. And we know, right, that many of the clinicians, many of the hospitals are just also creating associations or foundations, or ERNs creating their structure. So what do we want? To create a system where everybody creates its ad hoc solution, creating a new mess, fragmentation, less effective to generate quality data and not on time, less harmonized and comprehensive across Europe, less attractive to do research in Europe, probably more cost effective? Or do we want to put a framework in place which is transparent, which is clear, which is serving the purpose of generating more quality data at the right time all along the process of the development of a product until its access? Thank you, Sheila.
Thanks, Jan. A fantastic summary of all of the activities that have gone on and a lovely challenge to put out there. I would now like to introduce Vicky Headley. Vicky is a rare disease policy manager at Newcastle Rare Disease Centre and has been long known for her involvement in the European Reference Network policy space for over 10 years. Vicky's going to take us through some of the activities we've been undertaking in terms of developing the white paper. Thank you, Vicky.
Thanks very much, Sheila. It's always hard to follow Jan, but I'll do my best. So I'm going to indeed try to summarize just in the next 10 to 15 minutes a bit more about what Together for Rare Disease has been doing, but really focus on what the vision is. So if we go for the next slide. We are, and you can click again, perfect. So we, as Sheila mentioned, we've been developing, actually turning a lot of the work that we did last year into a white paper, which we're submitting for publication, which will hopefully be out very soon. And this is quite an ambitious white paper because we found that there actually wasn't a great deal published on this particular topic, that is around ERN industry collaborations. So if we click again, there are four main axes or four main parts to this paper. Stop there, that's fine. So there are four main parts to this paper. So the first part really goes through what the unmet needs are. So why we need public-private partnerships and collaborations in the rare disease ecosystem. And I think the speakers already have talked a bit about this. It all boils down to the fact that although progress has been made, we know that there are still huge unmet needs, that actually when we're thinking about medicines, around 94% of rare disease still have no dedicated therapy. And actually, if we want that to change, then we need to have collaborations between the public and private sectors. It's absolutely crucial. And indeed, this is not a brand new thing for the rare disease field. It's arguably a new thing for the ERN field, and I'll explain more about that in a second. But it's not a new thing for the rare disease field. And as Jan said very nicely, this is not a new thing for the cancer field and the rare cancer field. So that first section really talks about how, why the collaborations are so important. And it also talks about Europe's need to position itself as competitively as we can. And that actually collaborations is the way forward. The second section introduces a bit more about ERN research to date. We outline what some of the amazing potentials are of the ERN structure and why they're so perfectly placed to do actually all sorts of things in an ideal world if time and resource were unlimited. But research, there's real potential of the ERN structure to do research, to bring things together, to be more harmonized and to be exploiting data, leveraging data much better, for example. So we explain a bit in there about what ERNs have been doing at the high level over their first 5-6 years around research, noting that actually, for many ERNs, a lot of that first period has been taken up with just the necessities of setting up your network, getting centres working together, getting the task forces, working on the virtual care side. So it's natural that for some, the focus on research is a little bit later. But we particularly try to hone in on this topic of why we haven't had very much ERN industry collaboration. And we try here to really analyse and pull out some of the different perspectives. We don't give a single answer and say this is a single reason why we haven't had very much collaboration between industry and ERNs. It's a really multifaceted topic, and depending who you ask, people will give different reasons for this, but we try to summarize a few of these. So one quite tangible barrier, if you talk to most people here, has been actually the statements produced by the Board of Member States of ERNs. So if we just click once more, the Board of ERNs does a lot of important work in guiding the work of the networks, and they released statements in 2016 and an update in 2019 to try to give some sort of guiding principles here. However, there's been a general feeling that actually the statements have come across as kind of warning people off a little bit, that they create a little bit of a block or a bit of a wall between ERN collaboration with industry. Particularly this point number 5, noting that there should be no funding from industry directly allocated. That's really important. The various activities, including at the end there, establishing and maintaining patient registries. Now, that's not to say that we should have a free-for-all in the rare disease field, that everyone should go ahead and collaborate with companies however they wish. But as Jan explained, we've done this in the rare disease field for a long time, and there generally aren't these outrages. People have developed tools and codes of practice and codes of conduct to help to manage all of these situations. So there is a feeling that actually quite a few people say to me all the time, we would like to see an updated Board of Member States statement that's a little bit more open and supportive of these collaborations and shows the potential between the different actors working together, and not just this is a big concern and we have to be very careful. So if we click again, Sophia. So the conflict of interest, as I mentioned, the need to manage that is sometimes cited as a bit of a barrier, and there's been talk about developing things like shared conflict of interest statements and using codes of practices across the ERNs so that each ERN doesn't do this individually. Some people, if you talk to them, will say that the fact that ERNs themselves are not legal entities is a challenge, and that makes collaboration very difficult. Others will say, actually, there are workarounds. So ERNs are composed of legal entities, many of them, and there's always a coordinating centre, a university or a university hospital, or there's a sort of research leading organisation that can kind of take on that role. So what we're doing in Together for Rare Disease is thinking about what's possible now to try to get some collaborations going, but also thinking about what people would like to see in the future. What would our ideal picture look like here in 5 to 10 years' time? I think we also have to be wary of the fact that ERNs came from very different places. So looking at the 24 networks, there's a real variety in terms of where these communities came from. Some of them were very much research strong, very research mature, even before they became ERNs in 2016, 2017. Their communities, maybe not at that very high ERN level, but at a kind of subset level, they had their sort of focal conditions where there was a lot of network already in Europe. There'd perhaps been quite a lot of grant activity. They had registries, they were developing outcome measures. And so they had a greater, they were already further down that road towards trial readiness. So actually, for those communities, it wouldn't make sense to stop activity completely when they became an ERN. So they continue to do what they do, but they don't necessarily do it loud and proud as an ERN. It's more sort of quiet and a little bit more, not quite as open as we'd like to be. What that means, though, is that for all the fields where this wasn't the case, where they were perhaps more focused on care guidelines or virtual care or something like this, the fact that there seems to be this slight stigma around collaboration, I think has made it more difficult for those communities to actually reach out to companies and to start to forge those links. So it's just creating more kind of inequalities between the ERNs. Next slide. And again, perfect. So part 3 of the white paper of the publication tries to present some of the solutions. So this is where we really try to tell the story about what Together for Rare Disease is. And we also try to sort of theorize some different legal frameworks and models for collaboration. So the 2 key ones that we talk about are, for example, a consortium model, where you have kind of loose collaborations between networks, but you have at least one center, one institution, who's kind of playing that legal entity role and can do contracting, etc., and work with the others. Or you could think about something like a more true third-party legal entity, third-party framework, where you have a foundation on the outside or some sort of otherwise research organization, which is playing that role either for specific ERNs or actually even potentially a sort of super organization doing the kind of bureaucracy, doing the contracting, doing the legal stuff on behalf of all ERNs. And again, the project has quite a long viewpoint here. So we're thinking about what we can do now to get things moving, but always thinking about what people would ideally like to see in the future. The document also presents little snippets about some of the case studies that Sheila mentioned earlier. So we thought it was important to remind the rare disease field that actually this is not new, that activity in the research space with companies has happened for a long time, and we have some really good examples of this. So if we just click, this slide just shows some of the logos of the case studies that were suggested to us. Some of these are newer, some of them have been going for well over a decade, and you can see there's some from the cancer field like Accelerate or the ITCC. They fall into loosely two camps. So I would say, you know, around half of these concern registry related industry and network activity, not necessarily ERNs, but examples of where a group of clinicians or a group of multiple stakeholders have worked with industry in some sort of collaborative way to advance clinical research broadly. So some of them are registry related, others are more broadly around supporting clinical trial development. And some of them are quite new, like the ECET, the European Collaboration for Epilepsy Trials. Others like TreatNMD really predate the ERN landscape. And that's about lots of different activities, lots of different ways of working with companies to enhance trial readiness. If we click again. So we tried to present these and to extrapolate some learning lessons from those. To think about, you know, not that we're presenting these as perfect solutions of how we can do public-private partnerships, but we did lots of discussions with stakeholders last year about what kind of good practices can we pull out from these? What are the things to avoid when we try to do this more and more in the ERN space? And all of this is helping us move into the pilots that Sheila mentioned earlier. The final part of the white paper is all around our conclusions as they are at the moment at this first stage, our recommendations, and of course our policy asks. So what we try to really get across in that section is that we want to start moving on this now, that, you know, the discussions about how and when we can get ERNs and industry engaging together have really stalled for a long time. And pretty much everyone I talk to from all different stakeholder groups says now's the time to really move on this. So this is what we're trying to do. And as I said, we're looking at what we can do now, what's possible today with the structures that we have, but also thinking about what we'd like to see down the line. Trying to pull out considerations for pilots to bear in mind. So ideally, we want ERNs and industry interactions to be the best that this can be. And ideally, we'd like to do some more innovative things, like think a little bit less about company and disease area interactions, and think about how companies can collaborate actually together with a single ERN or with multiple ERNs in that kind of pre-competitive space. There's probably going to have to be an acceptance that sometimes that means a little bit of a change in mindset from business as usual, and that's the case for everybody. So particularly, you know, ERNs where there hasn't been a lot of industry collaboration traditionally in that field, it is a bit of a learning curve to think about what are industry's needs, what are their expectations, but the same for the companies. We really want to encourage the companies working with Together for Rare Disease to think about how we can tailor what they'd like to do to really have the most added value. Next slide. So these are our policy asks. The first policy asks, and we've got the link in the chat already. This is all around working on ERN governance. So thinking about what kind of form these collaborations might take, what are the appropriate ways to govern these sorts of relationships. Click again. So recommendation 2 is around preclinical public-private research. And actually there's a really interesting idea here to try to do something that's going to be really beneficial for all ERNs, regardless of whether you are research leaders or whether your field has not had so much research activity to date. So thinking about how we can create a forum or fora to try to have some strategic and maybe actually more hands-on discussions around how we can advance the health, shall we say, the readiness of a particular community to move into clinical trials. Next click. Independent, well-resourced and effective ERN registries. A lot of the discussions that we've had so far in the project have centered on the opportunity of these new ERN registries. And I suspect probably the panel will come back to this as well. This is about thinking about really what sort of roles, not just industry might play in the ERN registries, but actually what's the bigger picture? What kind of role should our member state authorities, our hospitals, the European Commission in future, who of course have funded these registries so far, what's the proper role and the proper collaboration and agreements and rights and responsibilities of all of these people? Next click. So our fourth is of course all around the EU Rare Disease Action Plan. Next slide. So this really is the focus of the remainder of this session. So this is our policy ask number 4. Which, as we've explained, we are very much supporting in Together for Rare Disease of the idea of a dedicated EU action plan. Jan explained very nicely where this idea originally came from the Rare 2030 Foresight study. And EURORDIS has done a huge amount of work over the last year or two to try to carry forward this, this goal. So last point, because we're going to actually spend a good part of the next hour discussing this in our expert panel, talking about actually, great, we want an action plan. What should that include? What should the content of that be in terms of fostering ERN industry collaborations? So again, I'm sure we'll touch upon these points, but we are really advocating for a framework approach. So thinking about not just ERN and industry collaborations, but how all these different actors, how the European Commission, how patients and patient advocates, how national authorities, hospitals, how all these actors need to be working together to help us to really leverage the opportunities that we have for better research, better unlocking of data, more patient-centered research. And we've already mentioned that the political will for this is obviously here. So we know about the support under the Czech presidency from the member states. Recently, we had over 50 MEPs renewing the same call. So closing words, the time for this is now. So Sheila, back to you to give us some thoughts with your panel on how we tangibly take this forwards.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I want to kind of express my thanks to all of the people that have helped contribute to the development of the white paper and the policy ask. It's been hugely valuable. And as Vicky said, the links to all of the things that have been mentioned by both Jan and Vicky are in the chat. So please refer to them and use them in any of your communications as you go forward. So we now come to the fun part of the webinar in terms of the panel discussion that Vicky and Jan alluded to. So we're really looking at, you know, how should a European action plan on rare diseases build that resilient infrastructure, promote that inclusive and sustainable industry, and foster the innovation in the context of ERN and industry collaboration. But before I start, I'd like to introduce my illustrious panel. So can I please welcome Matt Boltz-Johnson, who is an ERN and healthcare advisor at EURORDIS. Welcome, Matt. Can I introduce Professor Alexis Arzim-Manglu? I'm going to say that completely wrong, so forgive me for that, who is a coordinator for the ERNs and ERN Epicare. And Victor Martens, a government affair director at EUCOPE, and our MEP champion, Stelios Kimporopoulos, who has unfortunately not been able to attend the webinar, but has recorded a video for us, which the team will now play, and then we'll go into the panel discussion. Thank you, team.
So.
I'm not sure there's much sound coming, team. Can we just double check? Still no sound.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the event.
as MEP champion for Together for Rare Diseases, I'm pleased to offer my contributions to the important discussions surrounding the proposed European Action Plan on Rare Diseases. Unfortunately, I could not participate live today, but look forward to being updating on your conclusions. For many years, together with other colleagues in the Parliament, I have been advocating to urgently update the European strategy against rare diseases, namely by introducing a European action plan. The action plan will lay the foundation for the disease ecosystem of the future, one that I believe should remain centered in partnerships for the benefit of patients. This was once again reiterated in a letter I and around 50 other MEPs sent to the President of the European Commission on Rare Disease Day this year. We stated that there is no option but to work collaboratively in the area of rare diseases. For me, this includes public and private partnerships. It is undeniable that the European Union can have a high added value in addressing the needs of people living with a rare disease, as no country can tackle this challenge alone. However, the European Union cannot achieve this value until it launches a future-proof, cohesive and holistic action plan that reflects the needs of the present and our ambitions for the future. I recognize progress has already been made and look forward to the upcoming revision of the regulation on MEPs, as well as other policy instruments, such as the proposed European Health Data Space. These legislative developments should boost our rare disease ecosystem and support those seeking to find treatments for the 95% of rare diseases without the therapy. At the same time, I strongly believe we also need non-legislative action to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industry, and foster the innovation that the rare disease community needs. Beyond the support in the Parliament and the wide stakeholder community, a European Action Plan has gathered the support of 21 member states who endorsed a call under the Czech presidency, indicating strong political will. To conclude, I want to remind you that we must not forget to put those people living with a rare disease at the center of all we do. They must remain the driver for our action as policymakers, as researchers, clinicians, developers, and regulators. I'm pleased to champion the Together for Rare Disease initiative, and I look forward to continuing to advocate for the 30 million people living with a rare disease in Europe. I wish you all a pleasant meeting.
So strong support and advocacy there. So I'm now welcomed by the panel, who I'm going to put on the spot with a number of questions. The kind of first question to all of my panelists is, from your perspective, what's the case for having an overarching rare disease action plan for Europe? Why would you like to see the support for those public and private partnerships, particularly in the context of ERN and industry collaboration, included in that future vision? And I might start with where Stelios ended. The most important people to keep in our minds is the patients. So Matt, why do you think it's really important to have a rare disease action plan for Europe, but in the context of that industry and ERN collaboration?
So we've heard, and we all know that since the Commission communication and the Council recommendations where rare diseases was recognised, there was a flotilla of initiatives, including the ERNs being one of them. And really, 15 years on, the job's not done, and there's still a delay in diagnosis. There's still no available treatments for the majority of conditions. And really, have we got the best out of those initiatives? Can they together create greater benefits and impact? So this a EU framework, a single unifying framework, which brings all those together, optimizes the investment made so far and drive those benefits and realizations, we can move from a good position to a better one. Within that framework, you know, with rare disease, it's all about innovation. You know, the ERNs are innovation in itself. You know, people around the world look at them. And we know that that innovation doesn't happen by, or isn't the sole responsibility of one single group. So an EU action plan on rare diseases would be would fall short of the mark if it wasn't centered on, you know, enhancing and developing that proper partnership, meaningful partnership between the stakeholders in the community. And by doing that, we can optimize investments, we can optimize resources, we can build a more resilient system because we'll develop shared competencies, interoperable material, and having that framework in place will give that guidance, that policy guidance, which I think is needed, which is endorsed by the European Union, which makes us feel all safe, you know, which encourages those who haven't done before. We heard from Vicky that many of the networks are new and haven't developed these partnerships. And, you know, so give that support and reassurance because there's transparency there and there's rigor.
Thanks, Matt. Alexis, from your perspective as an ERN coordinator and the lead coordinator currently, you know, how do you see a European action plan enabling and supporting that public-private partnership piece?
Thank you, Sheila. Well, first of all, those of us that had the chance to be at the meeting organized during the Czech presidency, we have seen how important having a common plan and interaction between all those involved in care of patients with rare or complex diseases is important. And I believe that a common action plan for the years to come could even better federate all these actors that, as Matt said a minute ago, are absolutely indispensable, each one of them in their domain of expertise. Coming now to the partnership, I keep repeating the importance of understanding that the ERNs we are talking about are hospitals, and those hospitals already have regular collaborations with many stakeholders, including industry, because if this was not the case, we would not have drugs, we would not have new tools to diagnose not only the rare diseases, but even the common diseases. So this is already in place, and of course, it is already in full respect with the data protection regulations. The main difference, the innovation since the creation of the ERNs, in fact, is that although by definition, I would say, the individual members of an ERN are all highly specialized experts, sometimes in very small domains of medical care, it created a huge connection between different doctors, different hospitals, different medical teams, different diseases. And if we are seriously talking about targeted therapies in the future, if we are seriously talking about repurposing existing drugs, it is this collaboration that allows it, because I, as an epilepsy expert, may don't know that well the drugs that are used in metabolic diseases, but my colleagues of metabolics talk with me, which was not at that level, at least, the case before. And this is why it becomes a very innovative and important way of going forward. So to your question, how can we help this? How can the action plan solve this? I would say that the first level of a solution is to facilitate through the European Commission and the Board of Member States this sharing of data, because today it remains extremely difficult. And I make it clear about this because we need to understand that we have two solutions. We will either go on just validating drugs discovered in the US or Japan and receive them in Europe with 10 years delay, or we will become main actors. And to do this, we need to share the data, we need to collaborate with the industry, and we need to give our own expertise to this process.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Alexis. That's really helpful, and I really love the kind of concept of, you know, that sharing of information, the sharing of data, to be able to discover some of these innovations, and really for Europe to be a platform, to be a main actor as opposed to a side act. Victor, I'm really keen to understand where you see the benefits for industry collaborating with ERNs and the action plan and how that fits in for the industry.
Thanks, Sheila. It's always hard to be the last speaker. I think a lot of things have been said already, but maybe just start with the action plan. And again, I'm going to reiterate some of the, I think the key things that were said by Alexis, by Matt, by Jan. Ultimately, when we're talking about rare disease as well, the inherent challenge with delivering and developing therapies for people living with rare disease are complex. No single actor is going to be able to solve it alone. Not going to be a single magic policy solution. No single government going to be able to do it alone. No single legislative initiative or policy initiative is going to bring it all together. We need to be able to do this collectively. I think that's where, and I think Jan put it nicely at the beginning, is where this action plan can play a role. It's that shared and coherent vision and approach to addressing delivery and development throughout the life cycle, throughout the delivery cycle of all of these therapies. An action plan can help raise awareness, especially at the political level. It can outline what our ambitions might be, kind of set that target as high as it needs to be, guide EU and member state action, send clear signals as well to both the academic but also the industry world as to where we might be able to go, and outline soft policy initiatives. We need to kind of have that broader view of it, because again, like I said, it's not one thing. The diagnostics issue requires its own approach. When we look at developing and collaborating with ERNs, it takes a different approach as well. So it's about making sure we integrate all of that into one coherent narrative and one coherent path forward. Build on what we've done, as Matt said really well. We have seen a lot of improvements, but let's build on that and make that kind of, let's build on what we've done well and make sure we capitalize on that. Turning to more of that ERN, the public-private collaboration piece, I think it's fundamental to recognize from an industry perspective, from an ERN perspective, we all bring with us a wealth of experience from different perspectives, from different and complementary angles as well. A lot of our experience comes from the regulatory side, as well as a lot of the clinical research that we do as well. And staying in that mentality of none of us are going to do this alone. Why should we work in parallel, independently of each other, siloed of each other, if by sharing those expertise, we can avoid falling at the 11th hour? If we can unlock some of these data challenges, be able to collaborate, as Alexis said very well, we already do in other areas, it becomes all the more important when we're talking about small patient populations, where we've got limited patient numbers, limited patient populations. To make sure that we can exchange this data in an appropriate and safe manner, make sure that we can get the most out of it for those that matter most, those are the patients. So not much new there, but I think it's that fundamental element of sharing the data and making sure we work collectively where it's appropriate.
Thanks, Victor. And that kind of brings me really nicely onto the kind of key pillars that Jan talked about in his earlier presentation. So one of them was around this resilient infrastructure. And of course, ERNs have had sort of 5 years to establish, but of course, there's still challenges in some of the way that they are constructed and operate. So in terms of building that cohesive rare disease health data ecosystem, it's widely recognized that something that's needed to support that translation of the science into potential health benefits. So Matt, you know, from a Eurordis perspective, how do you think the action plan could set out a clear strategy for the future of ERNs in the EU rare disease ecosystem? And how can that action plan really support the ERNs to become much more resilient in order to respond to this really massive challenge that we're faced with?
Sorry. First of all, I think we don't, and we shouldn't wait for the action plan to be published. I think, you know, if you look for, you know, strategic vision at the moment, we as a community need to come together to define what that looks like. We need to set out that vision of what this research-ready ecosystem in Europe looks like. The ERNs are central to the rare diseases in Europe. They are here to stay. They will be built on and expanded. So coming together and seeing how we can, you know, build and evolve and mature what the networks will be, and we form the vision. That vision can be used to inform the European Action Plan. So I don't think we wait. I think we need to take action now. But the action plan will give that compelling vision, which almost gives the endorsement of, you know, the green light to go forward. You know, setting out the key infrastructure which is needed. Other initiatives like in the 18P space, they're bringing people together at the moment, multi-stakeholder, public-private partnerships to develop the resilience and of an ecosystem from ATMP development from, you know, basic research onwards. So we should be looking for that now. So I think that we should be co-creating this together and then using the action plan to sort of give the endorsement and the green light. And then from that, you will get this different types of initiative to support that moving forward. I think we've heard from Jan and from Vicky, you know, when this is already happening at the moment, but it takes time to build these partnerships. Treating MD didn't get to a place, you know, for day one. It took 10, 15 years. So our community can't wait for that. So I reach out and say to Alexis as the chair of the network coordinators, and to Victor, you know, from the industry perspective, let's get together and start defining that vision for what this ecosystem should look like, and identify the shared, where we can build shared competencies and reduce waste. So I think the one thing which I wanted to do from today's really was to really put a challenge back to Together for Rare Diseases and the steering group committee, because it feels like the bit for the policy which is in place at the board of member states is a bit of a red herring. It's an outdated policy. We heard that from Till. He quite clearly said that on the last webinar we did. So why don't we start as a steering committee to scope out what a positive statement on industry and ERN collaboration would look like. And let's use that to proactively engage the board of member states.
Thanks, Matt. And I like the idea of, you know, acting on what we've got now, building on that, and then using the action plan to kind of almost give credibility and support for the direction of travel. So Alexis, you know, let's just put the question around the ERNs being a legal entity to one side, because I appreciate that's a really difficult conversation and we could end up talking about that for a very long time. But from your perspective as an ERN, you know, the coordinator for all the ERNs, what elements of infrastructure and support are needed for rare disease care and research to really thrive in the European context?
Well, I will go on the same line as Matt. We already, I mean, I heard what was said about the first 5 years of the ERNs, and it is true that at the beginning we had ourselves to understand what these networks are, how even within one network they link the hospitals between them. Is it possible to have a contract with another hospital in another country, even within one ERN, let alone if you multiply it by 24? So now this is more or less understood. And I would say that the links between the healthcare providers, the hospitals, are in place. There are still legal issues to be solved, but we are not talking about this at that stage. So at this stage. So I agree that the best thing to do for the moment is keep developing the examples that Vicky showed a minute ago. There are already collaborations at ERN level, at hospital level, and so on, trying to develop new partnerships or ameliorate existing ones for a number of rare diseases between hospitals, between medical teams, between pharma, between other stakeholders. And I think we need to keep developing this. What the ERNs offer are also the facility to exchange the examples, learn from each other, because we do not necessarily have all the same idea at the same moment, but what a colleague did or an ERN did can serve to another one. And of course, these at some point will aggregate under the action plan, will be further developed or commune. And I would say the first step is, if we already were capable very rapidly to know where the patients of each rare disease are. This doesn't involve names, nothing. We just need to know in which hospital rare patients are with the same disease. Even this information is lacking today. And this is a huge step already, because when a new drug is available, a new diagnostic tool, whatever, then it is much easier to link the infrastructure. Jan used the word fear. I am convinced that if all these issues are put on the table in real terms, the fear will disappear. But for the moment, there's a kind of misconception of what we are talking about, and it goes on and on and on, as if we were solving everything in a day before starting. That's not true. We can continue doing what we are doing and expand it.
Thanks, Alexis. And I again love the idea of at least identifying where the patients are in that's a really good start for 10, because if we can start to map that, then that gives us a real opportunity to ensure that they are included in the research activities, they're included in potential opportunities for new care and new treatments that are coming on the line. And I should remind members who are listening to this webinar, please feel free to add questions to the chat function. And we are monitoring that on a regular basis, and we'll be looking out for those questions. So actually, we have a couple. What sort of activities would the panel like to see amongst the pilots? So we've proposed a few in the white paper, but we're keen to hear your thoughts. Is it simply about accessing anonymized registry data, a bit like Alexis has just alluded to, or is it more about co-creating registry modules to do post-marketing surveillance? And where can we be innovative? Victor, I might ask you this question as a starter for 10. So from an industry perspective, what do you think industry would like to see proposed in the pilots, and what kind of outputs would you like to see?
I think there's 2 points there. I think the second thing that Vicky brings up in her question there is key. When we talk about a lot of the value of kind of post-marketing authorization data, a lot of the challenge that we see with that collection is whether or not the industry funded or not, is the longevity of these frameworks. I think having those kind of frameworks working within the ERN framework, working in partnerships, ensures that we can have that long-term sustainability of real-world evidence, make sure that not only it has value in terms of the here and now, but make sure that we can establish better natural history databases, which are absolutely essential for any follow-up work. It helps us with certain post-authorization payment models. I think there's such a wealth of value of making sure that data exists as available to different stakeholders. That is an unmissable element that clearly needs to come out of this. The second thing, and again, kind of looking behind the screens as well, is the ability for that white paper and kind of the work that we've been doing is making sure we set up a basic structure, framework, and approach for these kind of frameworks moving forward. Make sure we give guidance so it doesn't it almost can become almost automatic. It can become easier for these kind of initiatives to be rolled out in the future. So we're not kind of going at pains and legs to make sure that this works, but we create a forum for this to be almost simplified and made possible wherever it's appropriate. So it's making sure there's a template we can work with.
Thanks, Victor. Alexis, what sort of things do you think, from your perspective, ERNs would like to see the pilots deliver on? And I appreciate a number of the pilots at the moment are looking at registry kind of activities, but of course, that's not to say that's the only thing that collaborations can exist for. So is there any other areas that the ERNs would find useful collaborating on?
Well, I mean, again, the term registry depends on what we are referring at. Is it just a set of common data elements, 10, 15, 20, which are already agreed between the ERNs, to be honest, or this allows the possibility to clip specific questions, research projects. Victor mentioned natural history of rare diseases. This is an extremely complex process that for some diseases, the rarer they are, may take years to find out what happens. So we cannot delay this anymore, and this data is indispensable. And I think that the first thing that we could agree with at the European Commission level is the difference between this type of collection of data and a simple research project, which has a beginning and an end. As a clinician, I face it quite often, even in my own hospital, saying to me, for how long this registry should be open? What data we close it? Never. That's the whole idea. It's to keep it open and enrich it with time. Because if we close it down after having spent, I don't know how many millions, in 5 years, we will have to spend the double amount of money to catch up the lost data on natural history, just to catch it up. So I think that these are issues that need to be understood by our colleagues that are not necessarily in the health field and do not know that if you close a registry where you collect data, natural history is lost in 6 months. And you need to start all over again.
Sustainability is a really important aspect
Yes,
for the pilots to be considering.
And the comment for Vicky, this also applies to the post-marketing surveillance. Again, it is a very strange issue today. Our own public institutions, like the European Medical Agency, asks pharma to provide the surveillance data, and we that keep the data cannot collaborate to give it. I mean, it is a quite strange situation. We should be able to give it, and it is for the benefit of the patients. It is the protection of the patients to find out what happens with a drug 10, 15 years later. And if the means are not there, it is the patient that will pay the bill. It's not the institutions or the doctors. So I think this is extremely important.
Thanks, Alexis. That's really helpful. I'd like to move on to the second kind of element of the pillar that Jan described. So inclusive and sustainable industry. So discussions at the ECRD meeting in 2022 on this pillar around the action plan touched on a more collaborative approach to facilitating the conclusion of risk-sharing agreements and reimagining access to medicines through the development of a public-private partnership. Matt, can you explain a bit more about how the ERN and industry engagement could support access objectives, particularly in relation to work around data and registries to support decision making? And Alexis has kind of touched on it a little bit in his previous response, but from your kind of patient kind of advocacy hat and your perspective.
So I just want to sort of take stock of where we are with the developments of the ERNs, because they're a force in development, as it were. You know, at the end of the first 5 years, we move to the next commissioning cycle. The focus is on integration of the ERNs at national level. But integration isn't solely a national issue. Integration of the ERNs, it should be also happen at a European level in the European system, where the ERNs can play a role in providing a second opinion or specialist advice about cross-border referrals to gain access to therapies and treatments, but also in that, you know, therapeutic development market authorization process, the ERNs can be really anchored into that system to be the go-to place to centralize the collection of that real-world evidence, which we've heard, to maybe get earlier access, earlier adoption, approval, and reduce uncertainties going down the line. I think the collaboration with industry as well is by having these, you know, communities of experts who are gaining the real world experience of these therapies in practice, building that knowledge on the safety, and the quality assurance side, you know, building that and sharing that back to the developers is really key. So I think that the partnership around this can really focus on accessing the expertise in the ERNs, not just the data. The networks being used to inform decision making around patient care, and to also many of the centres in the ERNs, you know, if you look at them across Europe, you know, I would say that rare disease and research across quite clearly it's an integrated activity. So, you know, Alexis Centre isn't just a centre which gives advice, it's a treatment centre as well, and it's probably a research centre. So the ERNs become this bedrock in the European system in the clinical trials environment as well. So I think all these things really are opportunities for the industry to collaborate with the ERNs and to form that partnership. I'm not sure whether I answered your question. Did I?
I think you did. I think you did. I think the
I
only thing that
avoided
I
the
was-
registry bit.
Yes, you did.
I'll leave that
So-
to Alexis.
So Alexis, it's probably a great place for me to pick up with you in terms of that kind of ERN and industry engagement and supporting these wider objectives that you and Matt have both cited in your responses. How can we really mobilize these engagements so that the registry piece can really be supported to enable decision making? So we've talked about sustainability, we've talked about data sharing. You know, what other tools or what other activities do you think, either at a EU kind of policy level that Matt's alluded to, you know, we need to collect ourselves from a central point as well as local, and or maybe ask of industry? What would you say? What would you say from an ERN perspective is needed?
Well, I'll try to answer the question. In fact, what I was taught years ago is that when you want to answer or to do a research project or a clinical trial or discover a new drug, first of all, you need a research question. And this research question, you cannot have it in advance. You cannot have it before having the idea or the treatment. What the registry offers is the basis that when you will have the question and when you will need the additional data related to this question, the basic information will be already there. And then it will accelerate the process because you don't start from scratch. You have the natural history, you have where the patients are. We mentioned it a minute ago. You have different ages of patients that can receive a new drug, for example, or a trial. And this will come and link with the registry as an additional element, which may have a beginning and an end in that case. If you're trying, let's say, drug A and it fails, yeah, you close this part of the so-called registry. You don't keep it open forever. But so I think that these next steps of collaboration should be taken rapidly. The other, where it links the integration of the ERNs into the national systems. Today, again, the ERNs, what are they? They are hospitals of excellence selected by their own ministries of health. And it is their role to link with smaller hospitals in the regions, because we can do whatever we like, but the patients like to be near home when they are sick, and it's normal. So it is much better, instead of labeling everybody an excellent center, to ask the excellent centers to link with the smaller hospitals and increase their capacity to share data about patients, give information. And I will end with one example. We are moving more and more towards gene therapy, advanced therapeutic medical practices, and so on. Do we really believe that tomorrow such complex treatments and so expensive can be delivered everywhere in Europe, in every hospital? This will not happen. And the patients will miss the opportunity. So our role as ERNs is to define the level of expertise needed in hospital A or hospital B, together with the government, together with the industry, to be authorized to provide this treatment. One, to have the expertise and make sure that you are not spending 1 million for a patient, although the diagnosis is wrong. And then when you have the good diagnosis, be sure that all the safety issues are guaranteed in collaboration with the industry and at centers that have all the infrastructure to ensure the safety of the patient.
If I can jump in on that point really quickly, I think
Please.
that last piece that Alexis mentioned is incredibly important, especially when we're talking about, like you mentioned, cell therapy, gene therapies, ATMPs. They are such neat, not niche, but technologically complex treatments that require that infrastructure that can't, like you said, Alexis, can't be everywhere, can't even be in each country possibly. So the role of those expert centers becomes all the more important. And that links to a second conversation around not only ERNs being a source of expertise for industry, but kind of the positive feedback loop. By having those expertise in Europe, it allows for these types of clinical trials to be done. And it creates almost this reinforcing positive feedback loop. The more clinical trials that can be done in Europe, the more clinical expertise gets built, the more healthcare professionals are aware of them, allowing for things like compassionate use and early use programs. And it kind of, it just all snowballs and builds into each other. It's not the one be all end all solution, but it contributes to that ecosystem approach we were talking about earlier. So fully agree with what Alexis was talking about just there.
And if
Thanks,
you
Victor.
allow, Sheila, if you allow me just one word
Please.
on this. Again, we should never forget that particularly for rare and complex diseases, expertise is gained not only by knowledge and reading, it's based on the number of patients you see. And that is what makes the difference. That is what maintains the expertise. You can read many publications, but if you don't see the patient, if you don't, so when we come to these very rare or very expensive or very complex treatments, Victor mentioned it like this. We may discover tomorrow that for some of these diseases, we just need 5 centers in whole Europe and not necessarily one in every country, because it is much cheaper at the end, much more public health related to have a private plane to bring the patient to the center than having centers everywhere that lose their expertise with time because they simply don't have the patients to treat. So it is quite complex, and it goes through collaboration with several stakeholders.
I just want to follow up with what Alexis said about numbers of patients. I'm not sure whether it's transparent, the level of activity required to be part of an ERN. I don't think those numbers in terms of to be joined Epicare, to do complex pediatric epilepsy surgery type thing, you know, what are those thresholds are making visible externally to industry and to other stakeholders, those standards that then you can see actually. I think that for me, that transparency doesn't exist at the moment. And I think that would be hugely valuable, because the clinical trials, identify centers to do clinical trials, you look at number of publications, because that data on caseload is not visible. So I think just a call out, Alexis, that, you know, maybe the ERNs should be a bit more transparent about those specific criteria for their individual networks, because that could also support what you're saying.
Matt. And you know, Alexis, you've talked a little bit about you know, learning through doing. So reading papers is one thing, but actually seeing a patient, experiencing, you know, the care and the learning through that process. One of the things I wanted to kind of understand from you is that, how do we share that best practice? How are ERNs doing that now, and what can we do to support the sharing of that knowledge across that wider stakeholder community?
Well, and again, this is one of the difficulties we meet when our actions to develop a network are evaluated only by some indicators that by definition are very restrictive and do not reflect the real action. No matter how large they are, at the end, they do not reflect this dynamic or motivation of the centers to link together. I think Matt is right. The ERNs, not only Epicare, ours, the numbers are transparent, they are public, but still what we are missing for some of these numbers, and I acknowledge it, is the proof that this is the good number of patients you should see. And this is the work that needs to be done. We have it, for example, in my domain, we have it for surgery. We know that if you don't have at least 20, 30 patients per year operated for epilepsy, you can't be good. But then if you break it down to some very rare diseases, the number might be much bigger because the surgery is more complex, the pre-surgical is more complex, and so on. So this should be one of the main jobs of the ERNs, try to provide to the authorities, to the Commission, evidence-based elements showing that this is what is needed. This is what needs to be supported as a number of centers, what tools, what medical stuff they would need to go towards that direction. And of course, when we reach the issue of treatment and particularly clinical trials or very innovative treatments, this becomes even more evident. But I don't think Victor will say I'm lying. Today, we are in a situation where the clinical trials that we bring from the US, we have more centers opened than the patients to be included in a trial by far. And instead of selecting the good centers that have enough patients to conclude the trial, a huge amount of money is spent opening one center behind the other that do not have the capacity to include a patient in a trial. Or if they include him without having the expertise that the patient selected really corresponds to the criteria, they may jeopardize the whole trial. So this link between smaller centers, expertise centers, is indispensable in collaboration with pharma.
Thanks, Alexis. And it's absolutely correct, isn't it, that how do we kind of build the expertise, but ensure that patients are supported locally as well, but also enable industry to be collaborating with the right people and the expert centers. So Victor, it kind of takes me on to the next question really nicely. So thank you, Alexis. From an industry perspective, what elements do you feel are needed for such engagements, so between industry and ERN, to unlock these benefits that both Matt and Alexis have outlined?
I think we've touched on a lot of it already. I think for me, again, just taking a step back, I think a lot of this goes back to something Alexis said as well at the beginning, is whenever we're developing new therapies, one of the key things we're trying to overcome in this field is the lack of data or knowledge. That's kind of one of the key challenges we face when we're looking at this 95%. And it's a question about if we can start to overcome some of these knowledge gaps, these barriers, kind of find areas where we can collaborate, share some of those areas of expertise and knowledge, we can accelerate the research and the development cycle. We can accelerate that then kind of movement towards access as well. So first of all, it's an opportunity to defragment in a way the data ecosystem. So that means we need to make sure we've got standards across registries, make sure they're properly interoperable and are able to kind of make sure that they're exchanged as well. Clarity on then the use and the ownership of the data as well. I think in a lot of cases, those are established, making sure that continues to take case, especially when it's framed in the conversation around collaboration around with the ERNs, but also what we're doing with European Health Data Space at the moment. And I think fundamentally, it kind of goes back to some of the policy asks as well. I think that Together for Rare is put out. It's making sure that there's clarity on funding, making sure there's appropriate funding, that openness to collaborate with funding for the private sector for that longevity, and ultimately being able to collaborate on both for the post-pharmacovigilance data, while having clear rules on when and where and how that data should be used. So I think it's make sure that clarity exists is kind of the short version of the conversation, if we don't want to rehash, I think, what we just went through.
Thank you very much, Victor. And again, this is kind of, for me, brings me back to the earlier presentation that Vicky presented on some of the policy asks. And one of the asks in that was a kind of exchange forum, a forum to exchange good practice, exchange what's going on in ERNs and in industry. So Vicky, I wonder if I could bring you into the conversation and just to ask you to expand on this forum for exchange idea that we had in the policy ask, just to explain to our audience, what kind of construct we were thinking about and what the opportunities might be in this kind of forum.
No problem, Sheila. So indeed, I think in the project we do want to do some quite specific pilots where we're looking at a particular disease area that's relevant for a particular ERN, and thinking about what we can tangibly do or what companies would like to do with the ERN and vice versa. And often this does come down to registry or data related activities. But it's really important if we want to make sure that we're not just, how do we say, supporting the more kind of research mature ERNs who are already doing this a lot in getting, doing even more research, to make sure we're doing something for all 24 ERNs, including some of the areas where we know there hasn't been as much, there's not as much basic research, there's not as much farmer investment, for instance, if we want to address that balance. And I think the idea of doing something for all the networks is really important. And that will come through the learning lessons from the pilot. So if we go through the pilots and decide actually we can come up with a nice, you're never going to have a perfectly harmonized template for contracting with companies, but if we can come up with, sort of blueprints that are going to be applicable and make that contracting process easy, great. So we will be generating tools to do that. But time and time again, stakeholders have supported this idea, and Matt mentioned this earlier, I think, as well, of having a sort of strategic forum. So there's different ways that you could do this. At a most basic level, we'd like to see, you could think about a forum where actually industry representatives and ERN representatives come together and actually talk about their field, because even that really hasn't happened so much to date because of these perceived barriers. You could do something like that. We used to have, the Commission used to organise the big face-to-face conferences for the ERNs pre-COVID. So you could think about a session at the end of that where actually industry and ERNs can collaborate. We could think, as you mentioned earlier, something specific at World Orphan Drug Congress. And that's important actually, because although, the companies who are joining us today and who are supporting the project, they are very knowledgeable about ERNs, they know what's happening. I think the ERNs are doing so much that actually we're still missing a kind of a PR exercise in Europe. The networks are so busy doing everything, they don't have the time to go out and do all of this PR and do hundreds of publications and, let everybody in their country know what's happening. So there will be companies, especially smaller ones, that don't know very much about what the ERNs are doing. So at the very least, we want to open that up. But you can go much further. You could think about, ERN specific sessions with companies that are working in or interested in a particular ERN's area. And you could think about, assessing the state of the art of that research pipeline of that community. Again, a little bit like one of the case studies, Accelerate, that I showed on the slide before, which is from the pediatric cancer space, where they have these multi-stakeholder meetings and they bring together industry representatives, academics, clinicians, patients, patient advocates, HTA bodies, or everybody comes together. And you really look at, what's coming up in the pipeline. How strong is our basic research? Have we got validated biomarkers? Are our outcome measures good enough, etc.? And they really highlight these problems. Maybe those problems are then addressed through subsequent calls, maybe through something like the Moonshot, or you could actually take it even a step further. So again, we can think of different levels for forums. You could even think about, fora, if we could fund these sorts of fora, where the stakeholders try to work on solutions for these. They don't just expose what are the issues, what are the gaps for our field. They really try to work on solutions. People have even suggested we could do something like France has for its proof of concept club, which the Foundation Maladie Rare runs, where you kind of almost matchmake companies with academics, researchers who have a research idea that they want to pitch, and they do kind of a lightning pitch, and you start to build these collaborations that way. So there's lots of discussions I think we need to have with the broader field about what sort of model would fit best. But I think, you can envisage something quite involved, quite engaged, but even something quite simple would actually be a big step forward.
Before I go to the panel, there's a question that's come up in the chat about how to deal with competition between pharma, so expensive biologicals, for instance, when it comes to simple contracting procedures. Not sure we have the answer to that, but I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of the kind of reflections we had when we were developing the white paper around some of this.
So competition in terms of who will be collaborating with whom, or?
Nico, I'm going to try and maybe read into what I think you've said, but I think it's potentially around maybe two companies being interested in the same space,
Right.
and how that collaboration may. And Nico, if I've got that wrong, please feel free to add any more context to that question.
And indeed, Nico's perfectly placed to know this. So Nico leads the Legal and Ethics Working Group within the Board of Member States. And those statements do say actually that, the board would like to see ideally a multiple company collaboration with ERN. So this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about us trying to sort of change mindsets a little bit and try to change the way we do things. And traditionally, yes, a particular company would come to, I don't know, the rare eye disease or the neuromuscular community, and you would, form a one-to-one contract to do something, to provide data, to develop some sort of outcome measures, development workshop, something like this. And so we do want to see more of that. Part of it comes down to, I think, very, very tactful moderators like Sheila, who are, really trying to open up people's minds a little bit in these discussions on both sides. So to think, if you've got a couple of companies interested in the registry space, for example, you've got companies who are interested in developing ERN registries to collect more disease-specific data. Is there something around a sort of central platform or that infrastructure that actually companies could agree to sort of fund collaboratively? And I know that's not always easy. It's a slightly different, it's a different business model to what most companies are used to probably working with. But it probably is the way forward. If we can think about, not one company paying for the development of a new module to collect post-marketing data on a condition which they're not looking at, but a rival is. But if we can think about how we can make the whole of, say, let's say a rare liver registry ecosystem more federated, more fair, if we can do those things together that have an added value for the whole community and for all companies who would like in future to use that registry ecosystem to do more sort of post-marketing surveillance, for instance, that's got to be a benefit.
And that's certainly something that we're exploring in some of the pilots, where we've had a number of proposals for registries from individual companies, but those companies, I have to be, I'm pleased to say, are very open to collaborating with others in order to continue to kind of augment and serve a kind of wider purpose, I suppose, is what we're trying to think about here. So I certainly think that's a doable activity. Alexis, I mean, the forum exchange piece that Vicky's just described around kind of this preclinical research and translational activities, how we can bring that to patients, and we really try to explore in the Together for Rare Diseases piece about what that forum could look like. But what kind of benefit do you see this having for the ERNs if a forum for exchange was to be developed?
Well, I mean, the preclinical is a domain that definitely needs to be developed further within the ERNs. It could not be done for the moment because the ERNs, the conception of the whole system is clinical care, direct clinical care, is not clinical research, and even less preclinical research. On the other hand, indirectly, the link exists because those that do the preclinical research, who are they? The laboratories of the university hospitals that are members of the ERNs and with the same people. I mean, it's not under the hat of the ERN, but these are, so the ways to link these processes and with the different other research teams that eventually are not labeled because they are not care providers, that is relatively easy to do if we have a forum like this where we have exchange of ideas and and a regular partnership with the other stakeholders. And I would like to bring it back also. I mean, it's more up to Victor to discuss this, but I am not that convinced. Of course, I'm not naive. There is a competition between companies, but it is also a competition between hospitals, between doctors, between whatever you want. I mean, if you want to get a grant, by definition, your grant is competitive with a grant of someone else who may also have a good idea of research, but as you have only one to fund, you choose one of the two. So honestly, there are ways of collaborating. We do not necessarily need a model that everybody has to have the same level of contribution, independently of how many drugs they have out there for an area of disease. This will never happen. But when you say a common platform, the technical part of the platform that costs usually more expensive than all the rest because the doctors work for nothing to put the data in, this could be a multi-company product. And then, of course, each company may protect the part of the data that concerns their own product or drug or whatever. That's a technical issue. It's not a... So there are ways out of collaboration and using this, and it's not, everything is not competition, even with pharma. When we build together platforms for patients with information, if they are common, or at least there is a common contribution, they become much more sustainable than if they depended only for the period that the given company supports a given action. So in real life, it happens already again. So.
Thanks, Alexis. Victor, just kind of touching on that very quick point that Alexis raised. What's your steer or your thought process around, you know, industry and their view on collaboration around this sort of piece?
I think like Alexis kind of put it, I think there is that willingness to collaborate when it comes to specific cases. Obviously, we need to be careful of kind of how that collaboration is done. But obviously, we do look at places where we see companies active in the same field. And I think, as you put it as well, in the context Together for Rare, a lot of these companies have been open and looking to bring different companies on board. I think they've actively been seeking that out. It's partnership, not just between different stakeholders, but within the community as well, where that's appropriate. I think it's kind of hard to paint it all with one big brush because there's lots of nuance to all of these conversations. I think, like Alexis put it, I think there are companies working in the same space. It's about making sure that those boundaries are carefully aligned as much between different stakeholders as within the industry as well, to make sure we respect those competition elements.
Thank you. Matt, in terms of kind of the patient view here, obviously collaboration, sharing data, having a central platform are all positive things, but what role does the patient or the patient group play here in helping define what that looks like, particularly where it's, you know, data that is about them and their condition, and how do we kind of overcome some of those challenges?
I mean, you know, we talk about partnership. The partnership isn't between the ERNs and companies or industry partners, it's also with the patient community. So, you know, relating to, you know, the development of the pilots, you know, we've had an outline proposals for the different pilot areas where they identified the patient groups for those which are relevant for those, each of the pilot areas. So, you know, for me, just starting to develop the outline proposal into a proper initiative, you need to bring those patient representatives involved at that point to help develop and design the governance arrangements, provide assurances and transparency. I think that's fundamental. You know, this is it's not just a partnership between two groups. And I think that brings the trust from the patient community because they're involved and from the start. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. In terms of the partnership as well, the patient representatives can help to define and contribute to identifying meaningful endpoints and PREMs and PROMs and have that discussion, because to contribute around the natural history studies, to help get people to participate in clinical trials when, if it's down that, or to get data in. So I think that transparency aspect and also being a co-creator from the beginning is absolutely key.
Thank you, Matt.
Matt, can I add, Sheila,
Sure,
if you allow me,
Alexis.
Matt, can I add a task for you for your side? I think
Oh,
that,
you're naughty, Alexis.
No. I think that what we need to add in this equation we are discussing is a bigger number of patients that realize the importance of these collaborations. And this can mainly come from structures and from the patient advocates themselves, more than if it can come from the doctors or from the industry, even less from the industry, because we need the patients progressively that are not involved as the advocates. Those, we see the difference progressively. The patient advocates very rapidly understand how important these collaborations are, how sincere they can be, how protected they are. But this doesn't apply to a larger field of patients. I realize the task is huge because there are 30 million, so there's a lot of people to convince, but we need also to have some actions towards the larger community of the patients, including issues related to language, because of course, we between us speak English here, fine, but I am sure that my rare patients living somewhere in France would never follow this discussion, because so we need to develop this even further. And it's mainly the patient associations and particularly urologists that can help for this.
Thanks, Alexis. That's a really good point in that how do we kind of ensure the wider patient community is engaged in this conversation. So Victor, just touching on kind of beyond ERNs, this kind of forum for exchange between ERNs and industry that Together for Rare Diseases is considering developing. How can that link to existing structures and initiatives, particularly Moonshot, which I know UCOPE is a partner of?
Thanks, Sheila. And I think, again, not to quote Jan again, but I think Jan touched on it quite well at the beginning. I think the value of something like Moonshot is it's meant to be a platform for exchange, very much somewhat in the same guise as Together for Rare Disease. I think Together for Rare Disease embodies kind of the spirit of what the different stakeholders in Moonshot are trying to do. But it goes and looks at it from a much broader perspective. And one of the values of that approach is it pulls together the stakeholders in the various different initiatives active in rare diseases and kind of allows us to figure out where we might need to be more active, where we can reduce barriers to public-private partnerships. So it's effectively looking at what we do with Together for Rare Disease, but on a much wider and grander scale. It's about making sure we get rid of the fragmentation in the environment, making sure that we enhance the translational research ecosystem, develop infrastructure beyond the ERN system as well. And to make sure that we do work towards, and when it comes a Moonshot, to be able to address some of these challenges with the rare disease communities, making sure that we're not trying to recreate anything either in a sense. And that's why we want to bring all the different stakeholders involved around the table, so that we can make sure that we leverage what exists, identify kind of areas of shared expertise and knowledge, and work in a way to kind of bring some of that industry resource as well to make sure that we do overcome some of the challenges that exist. It's about making sure that we have that shared vision in terms of how we actually overcome some of the fundamental challenges with early development, pool our expertise and knowledge, and really identify where future additional partnerships are possible, not just with ERNs, like you say, but with other kind of research organizations, with other patient groups, with other stakeholders involved throughout the life cycle. So it's really about making sure that things from regulatory science knowledge all the way through to data exchanges to federation of data kind of all gets discussed, and we find the best way to move that forward.
So that's hugely helpful. So I really like the idea of using that kind of platform to map the different initiatives, identify the gaps, and find ways to engage people in addressing some of those gaps. So I've got a couple of concluding questions for the panel as a whole. Given what we've discussed today and the kind of need to mobilize Europe into developing some kind of action plan, what kind of actions and political commitments are needed in this proposed action plan to achieve the ambitions we've discussed today? And Matt, you kind of talked about building on what we've done already and not waiting for the action plan. So I might start with you in terms of what components does this action plan need to have in order to achieve these ambitions?
I think we have to nail down the policy as a sort of a central point, you know, something which is more of an affirmation as opposed to, you know, punitive or it's almost like, you know, we need to take the handbrake off the policy to enable the collaboration to happen. I think a component would be definitely, as building on what Victor has said, you know, I think we need to set up an open space where the ERNs and industry partners can, you know, get to know each other and mingle and identify those opportunities and synergies. I think we need to create that in a way to really just take the first step. So I think for me, those are the two main components. I think the third probably would be to try and identify some incentives there could be strategic goals which could frame the partnership. You know, we have them which are really successful in ERDIC, something which can guide the collaborations as well to look at areas which have previously been neglected. So I think those are the three I would identify.
Thanks, Matt. Alexis, from an ERN perspective, what do you think the action plan needs to really contain and capture?
Oh, I think most of it is already in the sense that it recognizes the need to use what we created or what the European Commission created, but to really use it, trust it, and use it as a work in progress that has the power progressively to build up very strong actions together with the patients and together with all other stakeholders. We are more and more, I mean, we were convinced from the beginning that we cannot do it ourselves and alone, I mean, and I'm sure that with this action plan, if the ERNs are given the positions they must have because they represent a certain level of expertise without which anyhow nothing can happen. So, and they have the infrastructure today. They are structured, they exist, and they are not virtual. I keep saying it. What is virtual is a platform to discuss a case. The rest is not virtual. It's real people behind their computer or behind next to a patient. So this could help a lot. And I think that the action plan, the same way as the action voted by during the Czech Republic presidency, again, 4 or 5 issues that were highlighted were very clear and were giving a good direction for a change in public health practices. The rest, we know it will take time, but let's do it quicker. That's all.
Thank you. Victor, last but very not least, any reflections from industry in terms of what the action plan should contain?
I think I've just got 2 points. Again, they're quite broad because I've tried to kind of listen to the conversation, try to kind of see how do we capture all these elements from ER and industry collaboration all the way through to collaboration with other stakeholders. But I think I want to try and capture those into 2 key themes. One is kind of maintaining a clear ambition to continue to stimulate innovation in Europe, whether that be through whatever format that might be, and make sure we take advantage of the knowledge we have. And the second is making sure we continue to have a holistic perspective when it comes to the health and the care pathways, so that we can ensure that we've got coherent and mutually reinforcing framework and that we don't kind of start to push against each other. So I think by bringing those 2 elements together, I think I'll try to kind of encapsulate what kind of everything I've tried to say today.
Thank you very much. I wanted to first of all say a massive thank you to all my panelists. It's been an amazing conversation and dialogue, and a big ask for developing this action plan. But if we, as Matt said, build on what we're starting on already, as Alexis said, get the patients identified so we can get them into trials and get them to access all of these appropriate therapies and get them on board with some of the actions. And as Victor said, open up those conversations and, be aware that industry already are open to collaborations, then there's an opportunity to really drive this forward. And I really look forward to hearing more about how the action plan goes, and hearing a little bit more about Together for Rare Diseases going forward. I'd like to hand over now very quickly to Jan for some closing remarks. Jan.
Thank you, Sheila. So I'm stepping in fact, in the absence of Enrique Terol, which was planned to join, but is taken in another meetings linked to his functions. So what I will do is, in fact, to quote some elements from the call to action of the Czech Republic, developed with France and endorsed by 21 member states, because that says really what the member states are expecting from the action plan. And you have the link to the document in the chat, but just to highlight elements, and at the beginning, it will repeat some of what I said before, but you will see that progressively it gets closer to the discussion in the panel, is that one, it says that they want to continue and take steps forward for a coordinated strategy for rare disease to better address the unmet needs and setting meaningful goals for patients, families, and society with an integration of national and regional levels. So that's what we said, and that's what the member states are expecting. And they highlight that despite the tremendous progress demonstrated by the previous measures that were implemented, and with the ongoing commitments and major investments, still there is the need for an updated framework at the EU level and national level. They highlight that strengthening cooperation and coordination of member states should be outlined in the European Action Plan for Rare Disease. This is strong because that means a council recommendation. It means member states giving themselves a mandate, not only to develop national strategies, but to coordinate at European level as in 2009. So it's member states themselves asking for it. Now, when you go into the 4 elements of that call to action, the first one is a call for European Action Plan for Rare Disease. I will not develop that again. We discussed it at the beginning. So I jump directly to the second one. The second part of the call from these 21 member states is to have early diagnostic for rare disease. So that's one of their expectations, as your question is, what are they expecting? And specifically, the Czech presidency calls on the European Commission and EU member states to support initiatives that aims at promoting the best newborn screening practice to ensure availability and equity of access, and which would benefit from a coordinated EU-wide approach. It's the first time that this is written in something supported by member states. We want to coordinate on newborn screening, so that's important. And second, they highlight the combination of the omic technologies and the need here to support an approach to cover on newborn screening, but also with the omics, an expanded number of disease areas and countries across Europe to better diagnose, and particularly the unsolvable cases. Now I move to the third pillar of their call, the third angle. It's the revision, obviously, of the orphan drugs and pediatric drug regulation. And what the message, the expectation of the member states here is, highlighted by the Czech presidency, is to say to evolve the incentive framework to maintain predictability for sponsors while enhancing Europe competitiveness. And they say that this needs to be a main focus in the European Action Plan for Rare Disease. So they articulate the legislative aspect with the policy aspect, right? And they say that they believe that this is a unique opportunity to define a model that is centered on unmet needs, again, of people living with rare disease, and to include patient participation, which goes back to the discussion in the panel. Second, to transform the European research and development for rare disease ecosystem, building upon advances of the past 20 years for the next 20 years, and this must reflect and connect development across science, technology, and policy, and to situate Europe as a global leader in research, development, access to diagnostic treatment and care, aligning with and maintaining competitiveness with the US FDA system. It's pretty precise, all that. And to establish European pathway for the development and access to ensure innovation coupled with affordability to gain that crucial strategic autonomy in research and development. And last but not least, to ensure convergence and coherence of relevant existing as well as currently negotiated legislation. These obviously include cross-border healthcare and ERN and the new HTA legislation or the future European health data space. And the last fourth pillar of their call, strong element, which gets even closer to our discussion, is the instruments for improving access to rare disease treatments. And here, what they indicate is to say that the revision of the orphan and pediatric legislations are only addressing part of the unmet medical need, and that there is a fragmented access to the healthcare across EU, which precludes many patients from timely access. And therefore, that the desired system should ensure sustainability for healthcare system and include additional solutions to address the persisting lack of treatments and inequality across member states. And that includes balancing the incentives needed to attract to develop innovation with the financial and fiscal sustainability of healthcare system. Then they go on by saying that the approach should consider clinical need, proven therapeutic value, cost effectiveness, volume of medicines produced, budget impact, while requiring robust evidence generation to reduce uncertainties about benefits. Who will do that and how we will do that? Public-private collaboration between ERN and industry comes first to do that. So we need to see how the thing plug, right, with the call from the member states. And they highlight that the COVID pandemic demonstrates that greater collaboration is possible and reflects shared responsibility between the national health authorities and the pharmaceutical industry with inherent price transparency. And to conclude, they say that strengthening European cooperation in pricing and negotiation is desirable, and they go on with a series of specific measures like explore feasibility of piloting cross-country mechanism with a value assessment, demand pooling, negotiating, purchasing model, supported by a dedicated platform, to explore the approach to affordable pricing reimbursement funding, including things like equity-based tier pricing, value-informed pricing, perform-based pricing, and subscription payment models. They also go on with joint negotiation, potential to improve accessibility to complex treatment. Further down, they continue by going through member states, looking for opportunities for joint procurement or procurement by the Commission on behalf of member states for complex treatments in particular and small population. So that is to say that all these elements, which are good, obviously for us, as you order, is good directions where to go, are now the directions called by 21 member states, but to deliver it, there is the policy framework, European policy framework, integrated approach to have stronger collaboration. But we see that in order to deliver on these elements, the public-private partnership is essential. It's a key success factor to be able to deliver. So that's all I wanted to loop. I don't know if Enrique would have said the same thing, but I have only quoted what they wrote.
Thank you, Jan, an amazing summary as always. I wanted to thank Jan and Vicky as well for attending and presenting today. I'm very grateful for your time. I would like to encourage everybody in the last couple of minutes to continue to engage with all of our EU institutions and member states and MEPs and the Commission. Continue to make the case for an action plan, continue to make the case for more tools to build a more collaborative ecosystem, which is clearly needed and is being called for. Can I please also remind everybody to follow Together for Rare Diseases on Twitter and LinkedIn to see future updates on all of the activities that we are participating in. And we, as we said, hope to announce the publication of the white paper very soon. So please stay tuned for that. And thank you very much to everybody joining today. You will be able to find a recording of the webinar on the Together for Rare Disease website. So if, as I said earlier, you were unable to complete it or you have colleagues that might be interested, please feel free to refer them to that website. Wishing you all a very pleasant afternoon and evening, and I hope to see some of you very soon. Jan, did you have any last words? Okay, that's great. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.